When it comes to decarbonisation in shipping, much of the talk is around new technology, engines, and the availability of alternative fuels. But for these alternative fuel vessels to work, there is one very vital piece of the puzzle: trained crews to operate them. The vital role of the seafarer in shipping's decarbonisation voyage led to the formation of the Maritime Just Transition Task Force. Hi, this is Marcus Hand, editor of Seatrade Maritime News, and today you'll be hearing more about the Maritime Just Transition Task Force from two of its members. Joining us today on the Seatrade Maritime Podcast are Kulsoom Jafri, lead campaigner, Seafarers and Inland Navigation for the International Transport Workers Federation, and Arvind, senior manager, Marine Department for the International Chamber of Shipping. Kulsoom and Arvind, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Marcus. Thanks for having us on today.
Thank you for having us.
Great, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk to our listeners. Now, just to kick things off, some of our listeners might not be so familiar with the ITF and ICS, so could you just briefly introduce your organisation that you represent? And we'll start with Kulsoom.
Thanks, Marcus. So the International Transport Workers Federation, the ITF, we're the voice of nearly 16.5 million transport workers globally. Specifically, we represent over 1 million seafarers in over 200 seafarers unions across 106 countries. And we campaign globally and locally to advance seafarers' rights and secure decent and safe working conditions. We're fighting exploitation in an industry whose workers have been invisibilized for quite a long time. And of course, we're here today because ITF navigates the shipping industry toward a sustainable future.
Thank you, Kulsoom. And Arvind, could you just briefly introduce the ICS?
So, International Chamber of Shipping, ICS, was established in 1921, and we represent ship owners. And through these ship owners, we represent nearly 80% of the world's merchant fleet. A big part of what we do is advocacy on all technical, legal, policy, and labor issues at two very important United Nations bodies, that is the International Maritime Organization and the International Labour Organization. What we also do is provide guidance to the wider industry through our publications, and you will see some of our publications in the libraries of almost every ship around the world and also in maritime colleges and training institutes.
Great, so we've got two guests here representing both the ship-owning side and operating side and the seafarers. So you've come together in this just transition. Could you explain what you mean by a just transition? And I'll start with Kulsoom.
Sure. So a just transition, quite simple, is a people-centered response to addressing the climate crisis. According to the International Labour Organization, or the ILO, the specific definition is greening the economy in a way that is fair and inclusive as possible to everyone concerned, creating decent work opportunities and leaving no one behind. And this really means that we need to maximize the social and economic opportunities of climate action, but carefully manage any challenges, including through effective social dialogue, which we're doing here with ITF and ICS. And also, we need to respect fundamental labor rights. So I think a really good example of this is the UK's coal mine closures. This serves as a really poignant example of why a just transition is critical, because without it, economic hardship, social unrest, and environmental failure are even more likely. But with a just transition, we can create a greener and more equitable future for all.
Well, that's an interesting explanation in terms of another industry. Arvind, I'd like to pass over to you.
So I can put this in a maritime context, and just to make it very simplistic, our current workforce is nearly 1.9 million strong, and our industry is going through a major transition. We are embracing a lot of green technological advancement, and we are trying to achieve a target. So the IMO has set a target to be completely green, that is net zero, by or around 2050. So for us, just transition in a maritime perspective means that we want our current workforce to be relevant even in the new era when we have future fuel ships, we have ships which have advanced technologies. We want to empower our seafarers so that they can still continue to work and remain relevant as a very strong workforce into the future. So, our underlying mantra is that we want to leave no one behind while the industry is transitioning towards a new propulsion revolution. So that's what it means in the maritime context.
Okay, that's a very good message, leaving no one behind. I think kind of following on from that, really, what led to the formation of the Maritime Just Transition Task Force? And coming back to you, Kulsoom.
Sure. So our task force was formed at COP26 to ensure that shipping's response to the climate emergency put seafarers and communities at the heart of the solution. So when I started at the ITF 4 years ago, in the middle of the pandemic, when our affiliate unions were doing everything they could to protect seafarers against the uncertainties they faced, we found that the maritime industry, governments, employers, unions, all of us, we really tried to find solutions for seafarers, but it became clear that we were all fragmented. So instead of trying to come together as an industry, solutions were kind of had in silos. And this was really a major lesson. And we have this climate crisis upon us. And I think we all came together to realize we can't afford to remain fragmented on these solutions. So it's really important that governments, companies, employers, ship owners, unions, we all come together for a solution. And the task force is the first example of a global task force on just transition in any industry. So there have been examples at national levels, like the coal industry in Canada, but never before have governments, employers, and unions set up a structure for an industry at a global level. So this is really an experiment in industrial social dialogue at an international level.
What I feel unique about the Maritime Just Transition Task Force is that it is, at least in the maritime industry, it is one of the first initiatives which include employers and employees working together towards a common goal. So I think that this makes it truly an inclusive collaboration. We are extremely proud that what started from a coffee conversation on the sidelines of COP26 has now become a globally recognized initiative. So our achievements starting from the second half of 2021 are that we have created awareness of the importance of placing the seafarer at the center of this transition towards a greener industry. And we believe that seafarers will be the key to achieve IMO's decarbonization targets. Of that, we are absolutely confident.
If you'd like to learn more about the Maritime Just Transition Task Force, there will be a panel discussion at Seatrade Maritime Crew Connect Global on 12th November in Manila. Go to crew-connect-global.com to find out more. Now, Arvind, you actually mentioned before there's 1.9 million seafarers, or the workforce, and perhaps you can explain to our listeners a little bit about the scale of the issue the industry faces in relation to decarbonisation and seafarers. I'll come to Kulsoom first as the representative of seafarers.
Yes, so together, the task force, we commissioned a report with DNV, and I think this report is quite popular to quote in for a number of reasons. So I'll just run through kind of that popular statistic. But the DNV report looked at 3 different scenarios. I'll only describe the third because that's the one that's aligned with the Paris Agreement goal of keeping temperature increases to 1.5 degrees and has adoption of new zero carbon fuels like ammonia and methanol. So that's 800,000 seafarers would need retraining by 2035. And that's mostly existing seafarers, and nearly all seafarers would need new training by 2050. So there's no doubt that there's an immediate need to start putting the training infrastructure in place. And no matter which fuel or fuels are ultimately favored, transitioning to a decarbonized shipping industry is going to require upskilling and additional training.
Arvind.
Yeah, so what we have seen from the beginning of this initiative is that whenever we have these discussions about achieving IMO's net zero ambition, most of these discussions are around the technology that will be there, or the availability of fuels, or the scalability of fuels. But we believe that not enough is being said about the persons who will be operating these ships. So just to give you a better idea, you may have a ship which is completely modern and is completely zero emission, but to have the seafarers to operate that ships at a very conservative estimate, it takes around 7 to 10 years for a seafarer from the beginning of his or her career to progress to a role where that person would be in a position to safely plan and manage operations involving these new technologies. So we believe that this is now the right time to initiate developing training frameworks to equip seafarers with the right skills to work on board ships with these future technologies. And it's not just about working on ships. We, as part of our task force, we are also very much aware that there is a retention problem in the industry, and that is something which Kulsoom will speak about later. So these are the challenges that we are facing in the industry at this time.
Yeah, I think it's always has been a challenge for the industry that you can build ships much quicker than you can train senior officers, for example. Now, I'm looking at that and the task that's ahead of you. What are the key areas that would need to be addressed? And Kulsoom, I'll come to you for this.
Yeah, thank you. Arvind mentioned that the training for seafarers to handle the alternative fuels is going to be essential. And ultimately, our entire 10-point action plan, which was produced out of the DNV report, is to ensure that no seafarers are left behind. And so, how are we going to do this? Well, our focus is on strengthening global training standards, also ensuring a health and safety first approach. We need to champion diversity, equity, and inclusion, again, to make sure that no seafarer is left behind, delivering fair training, and finally, investing in skills.
There's quite a lot there to be done.
Yeah.
Looking at what's happened so far, I'll come to you, Arvind, and perhaps you could summarize what the task force has achieved so far.
At the beginning, when we started off, and what we now call as phase one was all about raising awareness of the importance of seafarers in terms of how much training they would require, and what is the problem we have in relation to recruiting seafarers or retaining the seafarers. And during in phase two, we branched off into two work streams, and I have been involved in one of the work streams, which is to develop training frameworks for seafarers to handle future fuels such as ammonia, methanol, and hydrogen. Now, just for the benefit of listeners, each of these fuels have got very specific characteristics, and they contribute to some really unique hazards. So, to develop training for these fuels, we conducted workshops, which was facilitated by our technical lead, Lloyd's Register, and we had about 12 workshops. We had more than 100 participants, and these participants covered a wide spectrum of the industry. So we had ship owners, seafarer representatives, technology providers, fuel manufacturers, and all of them came together to provide suggestions for what seafarers need to be aware when they're handling these fuels. From these workshops, we got over 500 actionable items. So we had to sit with all these actionable items. And then from that, we have developed specific knowledge, understanding, and proficiencies for seafarers to handle these fuels. So I think that we are now at a stage where we can provide concrete recommendations on what the training for seafarers should look like in relation to these fuels. And on another note, we are also working with the academic sector because we recognize that the expertise is not there in that sector as well to deliver this training. So we are working to provide support to training institutes by developing a kind of a train the trainer material.
Great, that's a lot of progress to make in that time, actually. I guess looking ahead from that, what would you then say are the next steps, Arvind?
Our main checkpoint, as we would like to call it, is going to be in February next year, where the IMO's forum which is relevant to training of seafarers. That's a human element training and watchkeeping subcommittee. They are meeting in February, and we will be providing them with recommendations on aspects that need to be addressed for seafarers when they work on these future fuel ships. And once it is submitted, it is now in the domain of 176 member states and about 50 other organizations, technical organizations, to debate on every aspect of it. So I don't believe that these discussions will be resolved in a week. I don't believe it will be resolved in a year as well. But at least we have got a baseline training framework, a basis from where we can work on, and that I believe is one of the key achievements that I can say I'm proud of from this task force.
That's a lot of people to get agreement from as you move forwards.
Absolutely.
Cool. So perhaps you can give a perspective from the ITF side.
Yeah, definitely. So yes, I just want to applaud all the work that's already been done. I mean, this is a heavy lift, and I think it's been done with grace and, as you said, to bring all of this consensus together. So just really applaud the task force for everything it's done so far. But we're definitely not stopping there. We still have a lot of work to do. So we actually have two more upcoming work streams. The first is around recruitment and retention, which focuses on supporting seafarer career pathways at sea and at shore, and also addresses seafarer attrition and the attractiveness of the industry. And second, we have the national level advisory body blueprint, which takes a holistic approach to what countries can be doing to support a just transition in maritime. And so this can include how they approach the STCW convention. So the government's applicability of STCW on new and alternative fuels to adhere to just transition principles. We've seen this done in the Philippines, for example. And STCW really sets the scene for training. So that's one recommendation. We also talk about change management and transformation for seafarers, because in an evolving industry, seafarers entering a transitional period will face new challenges with the new fuels and energy sources. And so we need to help them understand this change, make sure that their mental health, requalification, reorientation, and resilience is really at the focus. Obviously, you mentioned earlier the cross-sectoral career opportunities. Government should be would be encouraged to facilitate and increase an awareness of careers at sea, because the maritime industry will need to attract and build and grow its workforce. And this can't be done without tackling inequalities. And so we would encourage national level advisory bodies to champion diversity, equity, and inclusion principles and ensure that, again, no seafarer is left behind. And finally, the task force is a really good example of knowledge sharing and global collaboration on best practice for the industry. So we would really encourage that at a national level as well.
I think one of the messages that really does come through from this is about leaving no one behind. And I think that's a great message. With that, actually, what would be your key message to our listeners to take away from this conversation? And I'll come back to you, Kulsoom, first.
So I think we've spent half an hour talking about the just transition, and it's very obvious that the maritime industry has to face up to the role it plays in climate change. And we need to hold ourselves accountable for the emissions that we're responsible for. And I would be remiss to mention, especially in the context of yesterday's election in the US, that climate disaster is not coming. It's already here. And we've seen this just this month, the consequence on human life from the floods in Spain. We consistently see extreme weather disasters from around the world, droughts in East Africa and Central America, floods in South Asia, wildfires in Australia. Everyday people have to evacuate their homes. They face risk of injury and, frankly, death. And we all can agree that people really just deserve safety. And this includes seafarers who deserve vessels that are safe to work on and a planet that's safe to live on. And the task force model, which we have here, can really be replicated with other transport sectors. So I would call on aviation, road, and rail to set up their own global task forces, because we all need to do our part. We have a moral duty to do our part for a sustainable future.
I think that's a very strong message. And Arvind from the ICS.
Yeah, so my message is directly now to the listeners. And what I would say is that wherever you are listening to this podcast, look around you and you will see several objects that have been transported to you via a ship's consignment. And this is testament that our maritime industry is truly resilient in that during the global pandemic, this was the only industry that was working 24/7 and silently and as Kulsum said, invisible to most of us. So the credit to this must go to seafarers. And so our message is that we want to ensure that our seafarers, when they work on these ships with future technologies, they need to be working in a safe environment. And I know that there are several discussions about technology and fuels, but we need to bring attention to the seafarers who will be most impacted by this change, and also who will be the ones who will be best placed to ensure that our industry will be completely green by 2050.
Great. Two very strong messages there. I'd like to thank both of you, Kulsoom and Arvind, for taking the time to talk to our listeners today.
Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening, and we look forward to joining you on the next episode of the Seatrade Maritime Podcast.